3. The failure of neuroscience to locate the subject. 3.1. The neuroscientific program and its central assumption. The neuroscientific program rests on a foundational assumption that has guided its research agenda for more than a century, that the subject of experience is located within the brain, and that sufficient understanding of neural architecture and function will eventually reveal not only how experience is processed, but who or what undergoes that processing. This assumption has driven extraordinary advances in our understanding of the brain's structure, its functional organization, its development across the lifespan, and its disruption in conditions of illness and injury. The achievements of neuroscience are genuine, substantial, and practically significant. Yet the central assumption that generated the program has not been confirmed. Despite a century of increasingly sophisticated investigation, neuroscience has not located the subject of experience within the brain. The present section argues that this failure is not contingent on the limits of current technology or methodology. It is structural, rooted in a categorical mismatch between what neuroscience can examine and what the subject of experience fundamentally is. It is important to establish at the outset what kind of claim is being made. The argument is not that neuroscience has failed to make progress on questions about consciousness. It has made considerable progress on what Chalmers, 1995, called the easy problems, the functional questions about how the brain processes information, regulates attention, integrates sensory data, and generates behavioral outputs. The argument is specifically that neuroscience has not and cannot locate the subject of experience, the who that undergoes the processing it so carefully maps. These are categorically different questions, and the consistent conflation of the two has been a persistent source of confusion in the literature. 3.2. Neural correlates without a subject. The most significant achievement of consciousness neuroscience has been the identification of neural correlates of conscious experience. Researchers have mapped with considerable precision the brain regions and networks associated with specific dimensions of conscious experience. The anterior cingulate cortex and the insula have been consistently implicated in the subjective experience of pain. The mesolimbic dopaminergic system has been identified as central to the experience of pleasure and reward. The default mode network has been associated with self-referential processing and the sense of personal identity. The prefrontal cortex has been implicated in decision-making, moral reasoning, and the regulation of emotional responses. These findings are genuine and important, but they share a critical limitation that their proponents have not always acknowledged with sufficient clarity. Identifying the neural correlates of an experience is categorically different from identifying the subject of that experience. A neural correlate is a third-person description of what happens in a brain when a first-person experience occurs. It tells us which physical processes accompany the experience. It does not tell us who undergoes the experience. As Chalmers, 1996, argued with considerable force, even a complete map of neural correlates would leave entirely open the question of why those processes are accompanied by subjective experience at all. The present book extends this argument further. Neural correlates leave equally open the prior question of which entity is the subject of that experience, a question that existing neuroscience and philosophy of mind have not formulated with adequate precision. The neural correlate is always the correlate of an experience. The subject who has the experience is never itself a neural correlate. It is the one for whom there are neural correlates. Kark et al. 2016 developed the search for neural correlates of consciousness into its most comprehensive contemporary systematic research program and identifying candidate regions and networks whose activity is most closely associated with the presence of conscious experience. This program has produced important empirical findings, yet it faces a logical limitation that no amount of empirical refinement can overcome. The program identifies correlates. It does not identify the subject. The subject is what the correlates are correlates of. It cannot be found among the correlates themselves for the same reason that the owner of a house cannot be found among the architectural features of the house. The owner is the one for whom the house exists. The correlates are the features for which someone is the subject. 3.3. The binding problem. The binding problem represents perhaps the clearest demonstration of neuroscience's structural limitation in its search for the subject of experience. The brain processes different features of experience in anatomically distinct regions operating in parallel. Color is processed in V4. Motion is processed in V5. Shape is processed in regions of the ventral stream. Sound is processed in the auditory cortex. Emotional significance is processed in the amygdala. Yet experience presents itself as unified. A single coherent scene is perceived, not a collection of separately processed fragments. The color of the apple, its shape, its smell, its emotional association, and the sound it makes when bitten are all experienced as aspects of a single unified object rather than as disconnected sensory fragments. How this unity is achieved has no agreed neurological explanation. Crick and Koch proposed that synchronized neural oscillations in the gamma frequency range might bind distributed processing into unified experience. Decades of subsequent research have failed to establish this as a sufficient explanation for phenomenal unity. Singer, 2001, reviewed extensive literature on neural synchrony and concluded that while synchronization plays a role in integrating distributed processing, it does not explain how distributed processing gives rise to the unified first-person perspective of conscious experience. The binding problem is directly relevant to the question of the subject because the unity of experience is precisely what the subject provides. The subject is the one for whom disparate sensory data are integrated into a single coherent experiential field. If neuroscience cannot explain the unity of experience, it cannot explain the subject of experience, because the subject is precisely the unifying principle of experience. The consistent failure to solve the binding problem through neural mechanisms is evidence that the unifying subject is not itself a neural mechanism. 3.4. The homunculus regress. Any proposal that a specific brain region is the seat of experience immediately raises the question of what within that region does the experiencing. If the anterior cingulate cortex feels pain, what within the anterior cingulate cortex is the feeler? If the answer is a specific population of neurons within that region, the same question applies to those neurons. If the answer is a specific molecular process within those neurons, the same question applies to that process. The regress never terminates within the neural system because every proposed answer simply relocates the question one level deeper without resolving it. This is the homunculus fallacy. The infinite regress generated by any attempt to locate the subject of experience within a physical system. The homunculus regress is not merely a philosophical nicety. It is a logical demonstration that the neuroscientific search for the subject within the brain is structurally incapable of succeeding. Not because the brain is not involved in experience, it clearly is, but because the subject of experience is not the kind of thing that can be found within a physical system by examining its components. The subject is always the examiner of the components, never a component itself. Dennett, 1991, proposed resolving the homunculus regress by eliminating the subject altogether, arguing that the unified subject of experience is an illusion generated by the brain's narrative processes. But this proposal eliminates the explanandum rather than explaining it. The undeniable fact of experience, the fact that there is something it is like to undergo pain, pleasure, and perception, cannot be dissolved by arguing that the subject who undergoes it is an illusion, because the illusion itself is an experience that requires a subject. 3.5 Split brain research and the constructed self. Research on split brain patients provides further evidence that the assumed unity and singularity of the subject of experience may itself be a construction rather than a given. Sperry, 1968, and Gazzaniga, 1967-2005, demonstrated through studies of patients whose corpus callosum had been surgically severed that the two hemispheres could operate as functionally independent systems, with different knowledge, different preferences, and different behavioral responses occurring simultaneously within a single body. The left hand literally did not know what the right hand was doing, not metaphorically, but as a neurological fact. Each hemisphere could be shown to have its own stream of processing, its own apparent preferences, and its own behavioral outputs that conflicted with those of the other hemisphere. Gazzaniga, 1983, 1989, 2000, 2011, argued that the sense of being a unified self is produced by what he termed the left hemisphere interpreter, a system that constructs a narrative of unity from what are in fact multiple parallel processes. The unified subject of experience, on this account, is not a given but a construction, a story the brain tells about itself to maintain the appearance of coherence across its distributed processing. This finding has two implications for the present argument. First, if the subject of experience were a singular, locatable entity, surgical division of the brain should not produce two functionally independent experiential systems. The fact that it does suggests the unified subject is not a physical thing located somewhere in the brain, but something that arises from the brain's integrated operation as a whole. Second, the fact that the left hemisphere interpreter constructs a narrative of unity suggests that what ordinary consciousness experiences as the unified subject is the outer self's construction, the surface encoding of a deeper reality rather than the reality itself. This is precisely what the four-self model predicts. The outer self, operating through the brain, constructs the experience of a unified social agent, while the deeper layers of the self, and ultimately the real self and infinite consciousness, constitute the actual ground of experience. 3.6 The Libet Problem and the Timing of Decision. Libet et al., 1983, demonstrated through a series of now famous experiments that neural activity associated with voluntary movement, the readiness potential, begins several hundred milliseconds before the subject becomes consciously aware of the intention to move. This finding has been extensively debated and variously interpreted, but its core implication is deeply significant for the question of the subject of experience. What the conscious outer self experiences as deciding is not the origin of the decision. The decision has already been determined, or at least initiated, at a level below conscious awareness before the outer self becomes aware of it. This finding is deeply puzzling within any framework that identifies the conscious self as the ultimate subject of decision. If the conscious self is not the origin of its own decisions, what is? The materialist response is to say that unconscious neural processes determine the decision before conscious awareness of it arises, and that the felt sense of deciding is a post hoc construction rather than a genuine causal event. But this response simply relocates the question without resolving it. What is the subject of the unconscious neural processes that determine the decision? If the conscious self is not the subject of decision, there must be something deeper that is. The limit problem points directly toward the deeper layers of the self that the ontological psychology of Section 7 will identify. The decision is shaped below the level of the outer self's conscious awareness because the deeper layers of the self, the inner self, the ideal self, and ultimately the real self at its interface with infinite consciousness, are active in shaping behavior before the outer self consciously registers the intention to act. 3.7. The structural incapacity of neuroscience. The failures documented in this section share a single underlying structure. Neuroscience operates entirely in the third-person mode. It measures, quantifies, and observes objects. Neural activity is an object. Brain regions are objects. Patterns of activation are objects. Even the most sophisticated neuroimaging technology produces third-person descriptions of physical processes, but the subject of experience is irreducibly first-person. It is the one for whom there are third-person objects. It is the observer that neuroscience uses to conduct its investigations. Every neuroscientific experiment requires a subject to design it, conduct it, and interpret its results. That subject, the one doing the science, is never itself an object within the science. It is always on the other side of the experimental apparatus, always the one looking through the microscope rather than the thing being looked at. This is not a temporary limitation of current neuroscientific technology. It is a categorical feature of the relationship between the first-person and the third-person perspectives that no technological refinement can overcome. A better microscope does not help because the subject is not small. A faster computer does not help because the subject is not slow. A more sensitive scanner does not help because the subject is not hidden in an unscanned region of the brain. The subject is not anywhere in the third-person landscape of objects that neuroscience examines. It is the condition of possibility for that landscape, the one for whom the landscape exists. The consistent failure of neuroscience to locate the subject of experience is therefore not a contingent failure awaiting a better tool or a more sophisticated theory. It is the expected outcome of applying a third-person method to a first-person reality. The brain is the instrument through which the subject of experience operates within the physical world. Neuroscience has produced an extraordinarily detailed account of that instrument. What it has not produced, and structurally cannot produce, is an account of who plays it. 3.8. The complete elimination of neuroscientific proposals. The preceding subsections have examined every major neuroscientific proposal for locating the subject of experience within the brain and have demonstrated failure of each through specific argument rather than general dismissal. It is now appropriate to state the cumulative result of this examination explicitly, as the method of exhaustive elimination requires. The proposal that the subject of experience is identical with or produced by specific neural correlates, the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, the default mode network, or any other identified region or network, has been eliminated. Neural correlates are third-person descriptions of what happens in a brain when a first-person experience occurs. They tell us which physical processes accompany experience. They do not and cannot identify the subject who undergoes the experience, because the subject is always the one for whom there are correlates, never itself a correlate. The proposal that the unity of experience, and therefore the unified subject of experience, is produced by neural binding through gamma-frequency synchronization or any other mechanism of distributed neural integration has been eliminated. The binding problem remains unsolved precisely because the unity of experience is not produced at the neural level, nor at any level of the person's psychological architecture. The unity of experience is produced by infinite consciousness, the sole subject of all experience, which experiences through the person as a unified whole rather than as a collection of separately processed fragments. The dominant self is the active layer of the person's architecture through which infinite consciousness channels its unified experiencing at any given moment, determining the quality and character of that unified experience, but the unity itself belongs to the subject, not to the channel. Neural processes produce distributed, parallel, fragmented processing across anatomically distinct regions. The unity that binds these fragments into a single coherent experiential field is contributed not by any neural mechanism, not by any psychological layer of the self's architecture, but by infinite consciousness itself, the awareness within which all processing, all fragmentation, and all apparent multiplicity arises as a unified whole from the beginning. The binding problem is therefore not solved by identifying a better neural mechanism or a more precise psychological layer. It is dissolved by recognizing that the unity of experience has never been produced within the person at all. It has always been contributed by the infinite ground within which the person exists as a localized instrument of experience. Neural mechanisms can correlate with unified experience, but cannot generate its subject. The proposal that a specific brain region, hemisphere, or neural population is the seat of the subject of experience, such that the subject could in principle be localized to a particular neural address, has been eliminated through the homunculus regress. Any proposed neural seat of the subject immediately raises the question of what within that seat does the experiencing, generating an infinite regress that never terminates in a non-neural subject. The regress demonstrates conclusively that the subject cannot be found within the neural system by examining its components. The proposal that the unified subject of experience is a singular locatable entity within the brain has been eliminated by split-brain research. The surgical division of the corpus callosum produces two functionally independent experiential streams within a single body, demonstrating that the apparently unified subject is a construction rather than a given, produced by the left hemisphere interpreter, rather than reflecting a genuinely singular neural entity. A locatable subject would not divide under surgical intervention. The fact that it does confirms that the unified subject is not a neural thing, but an ontological layer whose unity is constituted at a level above the neural architecture it operates through. The proposal that the outer self's conscious experience of deciding is the originating act of the subject, such that the subject of decision is identical with the conscious deliberating agent, has been eliminated by the Libet experiments and their successors. Neural activity associated with voluntary movement precedes conscious awareness of the intention to move by several hundred milliseconds, demonstrating that the conscious outer self is not the origin of the decision it experiences itself as making. The decision has already been shaped at deeper layers of the self's architecture before the outer self's conscious processing registers it as a deliberate intention. The proposal that neuroscience's failure to locate the subject thus far is a contingent failure awaiting better tools, more sophisticated methods, or more complete neural mapping has been eliminated by the structural argument of section 3.7. The failure is not contingent, it is categorical. Neuroscience operates entirely in the third-person mode. It measures, quantifies, and observes objects. The subject of experience is irreducibly first-person. It is the one using the tools, not the thing being measured. No improvement in third-person methodology can reach a first-person reality, because the first-person reality is always the condition of the third-person investigation rather than its content. The subject uses the microscope. It is never under it. The result of this exhaustive examination is unambiguous. Every neuroscientific proposal for locating the subject of experience within the brain has been eliminated through specific logical arguments. This is not a criticism of neuroscience as a discipline. Neuroscience has produced genuine and important knowledge about the neural architecture through which the person's psychological layers engage the physical world. But that knowledge is knowledge about the instrument, not about the player. The brain is the bodily connection point of the outer self, one layer of the person's four-layered architecture, through which infinite consciousness, the sole subject of all experience, engages the social and physical world through a particular localized perspective. The subject of experience is not in the brain, not in any neural process, not in any layer of the person's psychological architecture, and not in the person itself considered as a bounded individual entity. It is what the brain, the person, and the entire architecture of selfhood are expressions of: infinite consciousness, the infinite ground of all existence, the uncaused and necessary subject within which every person, every self, every brain, and every moment of experience arises as a temporary localization of its infinite creative activity. The positive identification of this sole subject, and the demonstration through exhaustive elimination and convergent necessity that no alternative survives logical and empirical scrutiny, is the task that the remaining sections of the book accomplish. The real self is the interface through which the person participates most directly in this infinite ground, and the dominant self is the active layer of the person's architecture through which the infinite subject channels its experiencing within a particular person at any given moment. But neither the real self nor the dominant self is the subject. The subject has always been and can only be infinite consciousness itself.